Let's explore how different English words are used in various countries. In India, we say flat to refer to the vertically separated residential places. But what about the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada? For this and other items, stay tuned to find out. In the US and Canada, it's called an apartment. In the UK and Australia, it's known as a flat. Sometimes in Australia, you might also hear it referred to as a unit. In the US and Canada, it's called a band-aid. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a plaster. Different words, same purpose. In India, we call them toffees. In the US, they are known as candy. In the UK, they are often referred to as sweets. Australians might call them lollies. And in Canada, they are also called candy. Different words, same delightful treats. In the United States and Canada, people usually say cell phone. Yep, cell phone. But over in the UK, Australia, and India, you'll hear mobile or mobile phone more often. So, just to recap, it's cell phone in the US and Canada and mobile phone in the UK, Australia, and India. Alright, let's talk about snacks. In India and the US, they're called chips. However, in the UK, Australia, and Canada, what Indians and Americans call chips are known as crisps. So, it's chips in India and the US and crisps in the UK, Australia, and Canada. Moving on to sweet treats in the US and Canada, it's called a cookie. But in the UK, Australia, and India, it's referred to as a biscuit. So you have cookie in the US and Canada, and biscuit in the UK, Australia, and India. Just remember, biscuit in the UK, Australia, and India means cookie in the US and Canada. In the US and Canada, it's called a crosswalk. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a zebra crossing. Whether you call it a crosswalk or a zebra crossing, it's all about pedestrian safety. In the US and Canada, it's called a diaper. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a nappy. Diaper or nappy, the meaning is the same. In India, it's called brinjal. In the US and Canada, they say eggplant. In the UK and Australia, it's known as aubergine. Different names, same vegetable. In the US and Canada, it's called an elevator. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a lift. Elevator in the US and Canada, lift in the UK, Australia, and India. In India, we call it an eraser. The same term is used in the US and Canada. But in the UK and Australia, it's known as a rubber. So, eraser in India, the US and Canada, rubber in the UK and Australia. In the US and Canada, it's called a faucet. But in the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a tap. Faucet in the US and Canada, tap in the UK, Australia, and India. In the US and Canada, it's called a flashlight. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a torch. Flashlight in the US and Canada. Torch in the UK, Australia, and India. In India, we call them fries. In the US and Canada, they're known as French fries. Meanwhile, in the UK and Australia, they're referred to as chips. So, fries in India, French fries in the US and Canada, and chips in the UK and Australia. In the US and Canada, it's called gasoline. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as petrol. Gasoline in the US and Canada. Petrol in the UK, Australia, and India. The great debate between hood and bonnet. In India, as in the US and Canada, you lift the hood of your car. However, in the UK and Australia, it's called the bonnet. So whether it's the hood or the bonnet, it all depends on where you are. When it comes to sending and receiving mail, different countries have different terms. In the US and Canada, you would use a mailbox. However, in the UK, Australia, and India, it's called a postbox. So, do you drop letters in a mailbox or a postbox? When it comes to soothing a baby, the terminology varies across countries. In the US and Canada, it's commonly called a pacifier. In the UK and Australia, parents often refer to it as a dummy. Meanwhile, in India, it's known as a soother. So whether it's a pacifier, dummy, or soother, the goal remains the same, to comfort the baby. In the US and Canada, it's called a parking lot. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a car park. Parking lot in the US and Canada, car park in the UK, Australia, and India. In the United States and Canada, it's called a pharmacy. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as a chemist. Pharmacy in the US and Canada. Chemist in the UK, Australia, and India. In India, it's called football. In the US, it's soccer. The UK, Australia, and Canada also call it football. Soccer in the US, football elsewhere. Different words, same game. When it comes to footwear, the terminology can vary quite a bit depending on where you are in the world. In the United States and Canada, these are commonly called sneakers. In India and Australia, you might hear them referred to as sports shoes. Essentially, sneakers and sports shoes are the same thing, just different names. Over in the UK, they're known as trainers. And in Australia, you might also hear them called runners or running shoes. Moving on to baby gear, we have what's commonly known in the US, Canada, and Australia as a stroller. In these countries, this term is widely used. However, in the UK, it's referred to as a pram. Similarly, in India, the term pram is also used. So, whether it's a stroller in the US, Canada, and Australia, or a pram in the UK and India, they both refer to the same thing, just different names. Pram is more traditional, while stroller is widely used in the States, Canada, and Australia. When it comes to clothing, specifically that cozy piece we wear in colder weather, Americans and Canadians call it a sweater. Yep, sweater is the term you'll hear most often in the US and Canada. But if you're in the UK, Australia, or India, you'll hear it called a jumper. So whether you say sweater in the US and Canada, or jumper in the UK, Australia, and India, it's the same comfy garment, just with a different name. So, you might have noticed some differences in terminology when it comes to waste containers across different countries. In the United States and Canada, it's commonly called a trash can. Over in the UK, you'll hear people referring to it as a dustbin. In Australia, it's often just called a bin. And in India, it's also commonly referred to as a bin. Sometimes in the US and Canada, you might even hear garbage can being used. So whether it's a trash can, dustbin, or just a bin, the term varies depending on where you are. Let's explore how different countries refer to the same part of a car. In India, it's called a boot. However, in the US, it's referred to as a trunk. Interestingly, the term boot is also used in the UK, Australia, and Canada. This highlights the fascinating differences in language across these countries. In the US, Canada, and India, we call them underwear. In the UK, they might call them pants. And in Australia, you might hear them referred to as undies. Different words, same essentials. Planning a break from work? In the US and Canada, you go on a vacation. In the UK, Australia, and India, they call it a holiday. So whether it's a vacation in the US and Canada, or a holiday in the UK, Australia, and India, the idea is the same. Time to relax and unwind. This green vegetable has different names depending on where you are. In the US and Canada, it's called zucchini. In the UK, Australia, and India, it's known as courgette. So, whether you say zucchini or courgette, it all depends on your location.